She was a woman invisible to her own world, and he was the most powerful man in the province. But in a winter garden, he was just a stranger. She confessed her darkest secret to him before the clock struck midnight, never imagining that the man sitting beside her, wearing common clothes, held the power to destroy everything she held dear. And when the truth finally broke the silence, no one in the ballroom was prepared for the price he would have to pay to keep her. The winter fog clung to the gardens of the country estate, wrapping the landscape in a shroud of absolute isolation. Elowen wandered between the dormant rose bushes, seeking the fleeting peace that the cold manor barely allowed, when she noticed a solitary figure sitting on a stone bench, dusted with a thin layer of frost. He wore simple, plain clothing, devoid of the flashy ostentation that usually defined the high society men she avoided at all costs. The man seemed lost in deep thought, staring at the horizon with an intensity that betrayed a profound melancholy, something Elowen recognized instantly as a reflection of her own weary soul. Without hesitation, she approached, not as a lady seeking a suitor, but as someone who understands the weight of shared silence. The icy air seemed to warm slightly, drawn together by the gravity of their unexpected connection. Thalric, who had retreated there to escape the crushing weight of his ducal responsibilities for a few hours, felt her presence before he saw her. He had expected total solitude, but when his eyes met Elowen's, something within him faltered. There was no judgment, no hidden agenda in her expression. There was only a rare, quiet stillness that he had never encountered within the walls of his own opulent palace. If you are already captivated by the mystery of these two strangers in the garden, make sure to hit that subscribe button now, so you don't miss a single moment of this unfolding romance. Elowen sat at the far end of the bench, maintaining a respectful distance, yet close enough for a quiet conversation. She did not ask for his name, sensing that, in that fragile moment, social labels would be an intrusive violation of a space so purely shared. The man, for his part, observed her with guarded curiosity, noting the quiet strength in her features and the way she endured the biting cold without a hint of complaint. There was an undeniable power in Thalric's posture, even without his formal attire or the insignia of his rank, a magnetism that Elowen felt vibrating in the thin air. His dark, piercing gaze seemed capable of reading not just her words, but every secret she carried beneath her composed exterior. He was a complete stranger, yet somehow he felt more authentic and real than any aristocrat she had ever been forced to endure. Thalric found himself captivated by her lack of intimidation. It was a foreign sensation. Usually those around him either clawed for his favor or trembled at his authority. But she sat there, humble and human, treating him as a true equal in a game where the rules were yet to be defined. He felt an almost desperate urge to maintain the facade of a common man, terrified that if the truth were exposed, that brief moment of peace would vanish forever. Time seemed to stand still as the two spoke of trivialities, the nature of the changing seasons, and the winter's silence imposing itself upon the world. Elowen spoke with a raw honesty that disarmed any defense, sharing perspectives on life that Thalric rarely heard in circles saturated with vanity and hypocrisy. With every passing word, the strange sense of familiarity deepened, turning what should have been a fleeting encounter into something far more significant. For Thalric, every minute spent by her side was like breathing crisp, pure air after years trapped in a hermetically sealed room. He discovered that Elowen possessed a sharp, brilliant intellect, capable of navigating complex subjects he could rarely discuss with anyone, not even his own peers. It was as if, in a world of mirrors and hollow reflections, she was the first person to look through them, seeing the essence of the man rather than the burden of his title. Elowen felt a connection that defied all reason, as if she were standing before someone who, despite the obvious differences in their stations, spoke the exact same language of the heart. It was not merely physical attraction, it was a profound relief to be understood without the need for exhaustive explanations. On that cold afternoon, they built an invisible bridge that felt destined to endure, entirely unaware that fate was already brewing a storm to shatter their fragile alliance. Thalric understood that the anonymity his humble attire provided was an invaluable gift. For the first time in his adult life, he did not need to measure every gesture, every word, or every glance to avoid scandal or palace intrigue. The mask of simplicity served as a shield, allowing him to present himself to Elowen without the crushing weight of expectation, a liberation he had craved desperately. Elowen, accustomed to living under the constant, judgmental gaze of society, found in her companion's anonymity the freedom she had always been denied. She could be herself, completely unbound by the rigid etiquette that dictated her behavior, her speech, and even her very thoughts. The garden became the only safe territory where truth did not need to be molded to fit the cruel and superficial demands of the outside world. They spoke of dreams that had long been buried under layers of duty and convenience, finding an almost painful comfort in discovering they were not alone in their longings for liberty. Their anonymity was a tacit promise of absolute honesty, a vow of silence regarding who they were outside that space, protecting the present moment from any intrusion of the future. Yet, they could not have known that secrets have a habit of revealing themselves precisely when we least expect them. The conversation drifted toward questions of life and purpose, subjects strictly forbidden in the ballrooms where status and marriage prospects were the only currencies of value. Elowen voiced her doubts about the traditions that bound them to lives devoid of real choice, and Thalric, despite living at the very apex of the social hierarchy, found himself agreeing with every point, feeling the poignant irony of his own existence. It was an intellectual liberation that no banquet, no matter how luxurious, had ever offered them. Thalric listened with voracious attention, absorbing every opinion as if it were divine revelation, questioning internally every pillar upon which his life had been constructed. Her confessions awakened in him a desperate desire to challenge the very structures of his own power, a silent revolution that began there, amidst the dried flowers and the cutting winter chill. He realized, with a clarity that unsettled him, that the aristocratic life was a gilded prison, and that Elowen held the key he hadn't known he needed. As the sun began to set, staining the sky with hues of violet and gray, they parted ways with the implied promise that this meeting would not be their last. The night, however, brought the stark reminder that the world outside had not stopped, and the dawn would demand they both don the masks they had discarded in the garden. They could hardly imagine that the truth was about to collide with the lies that would soon define the path of their two lives. Here is the second block of the script, covering subtitles 6 through 10. But the peace they found in the garden was a fragile thing, and the shadow of the winter ball was already looming. A place where their secret would soon become a public weapon. Elowen found herself speaking of things she had buried beneath years of quiet obedience, a passion for painting, a longing to travel beyond the stifling borders of their province, and a desire to be seen for her mind rather than her potential dowry. It was as if the simple act of voicing these desires to a stranger gave them a weight they had lacked before. She felt a strange lightness, realizing that her dreams were not as dead as she had convinced herself they were. Thalric watched her, mesmerized by the fire that ignited in her eyes, whenever she dared to imagine a different life. He saw the sorrow of a woman whose potential had been systematically pruned by the expectations of her rank. For the first time, he felt the heavy mantle of his own influence not as a privilege, but as an obstacle to the very happiness she described, happiness that he now desperately wanted to help her achieve. She looked at him then, her voice softening, asking if he, too, had dreams that were currently gathering dust. Thalric hesitated, the weight of his hidden duty pressing against his throat. He spoke of a desire to build something lasting, something that wouldn't just maintain the status quo of his ancestors, but would actually improve the lives of those under his care. It was a secret ambition he had never voiced, even to his closest advisors. The reality of their world began to creep back into their sanctuary like an encroaching shadow. Elowen mentioned the upcoming winter ball, an event she viewed with dread, knowing it was merely a marketplace for alliances and marriages. She spoke of the suffocating pressure to be the perfect, silent ornament for a family that viewed her only as a means to increase their own social capital. Thalric grimaced at the mention of the ball. He knew all too well how those events were orchestrated. He saw the cold, calculated maneuvers of his peers and realized with sudden clarity that Elowen was a victim of the very system he ruled. The contrast between her genuine, yearning spirit and the hollow, performative existence of the nobility was a chasm that made his chest ache with a new, protective rage. The garden seemed to grow colder as they spoke of the societal expectations that threatened to pull them apart. Thalric realized that if he were to be seen with her here, in this vulnerable, authentic state, the gossiping tongues of the capital would destroy her reputation before the sun rose. He began to understand that to protect her, he would have to play a much more dangerous game than he had originally intended. That night, alone in the vast, echoing library of his own manor, Thalric found he could no longer find solace in his books or his duties. The conversations with Elowen had unmoored him, leaving him to drift in a sea of newfound doubt. He looked at the portraits of his predecessors on the walls and felt nothing but a hollow detachment, realizing he had been merely playing a part in a play he hadn't written. He paced the length of the room, replaying every word Elowen had said, every flicker of emotion on her face. He was a man who commanded thousands, yet he had never felt so powerless to change his own destiny. For years, he had been the stoic, impenetrable Duke, but Elowen had seen past the armor, and the exposure felt both terrifying and deeply, unexpectedly addictive. His valet, a man who had served him since childhood, entered to offer the nightly report, but Thalric dismissed him with a wave of his hand. He needed to think about what it meant to lead a life of total artifice. If he could be happy as a man without a name, sitting on a bench in the cold, why was the reality of his wealth and power suddenly tasting so much like ash? When they met again in the garden, the air was thicker with unspoken intentions. Elowen leaned toward him, her voice barely a whisper, and confessed that her heart was breaking from the loneliness of her life. She admitted that before meeting him, she had believed she was destined to wither away into a ghost of herself, a person who existed only to serve the needs of others. It was a vulnerable admission, one that required immense courage to voice. She told him that he was the first person who had ever looked at her and seen a human being, not an object to be traded. The sincerity in her words struck Thalric with the force of a physical blow, grounding him and reinforcing his decision to keep his identity hidden just a little longer, fearing that the truth would shatter the fragile trust she had placed in him. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers, resisting the urge to take it in his own. He confessed that he too had been living in a kind of exile, surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. His confession was carefully worded, omitting the titles and the lands, but it was honest in its emotional weight. It was the first time in their growing connection that they had both admitted, without hesitation, that they were lost. Thalric returned to the manor after their meeting, haunted by the growing complexity of his deception. He knew he was walking a razored edge. The longer he played the role of a common man, the deeper the wound would be when the truth inevitably came to light. He wondered if he was a coward for holding back, or if he was simply trying to hoard a few more moments of genuine, uncomplicated love. He spent the night drafting letters he would never send, and staring at the fire as it burned low, wondering what a woman like Elowen would truly think of a man who owned so much, yet possessed so little of what mattered. The guilt began to fester, gnawing at his resolve. He wasn't just hiding his identity. He was, in a sense, testing her, and that thought disgusted him, even as he couldn't stop the behavior. He resolved to end the charade at the winter ball, deciding that transparency was the only way to save whatever they were building. Yet every time he pictured her face when she realized who he truly was, his resolve crumbled. He was a duke who feared nothing, yet the prospect of losing Elowen's respect was the only thing on earth that made his heart tremble with genuine, paralyzing fear. Here is the third block of the script, covering subtitles 11 through 15. The tension between them is only just beginning. If you want to see how their secret world collides with the truth, join our community by subscribing to the channel. The night of the winter ball arrived, and the ballroom was a blinding spectacle of gilded carvings, crystal chandeliers, and the stifling perfume of hundreds of elite guests. Elowen stood on the periphery, her dress a modest but elegant silk that she had chosen specifically to blend into the shadows. She felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of the night ahead, knowing that every eyes in the room was scanning the crowd for advantageous alliances. She kept her eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for a glimpse of the man who had become her only true confidant, even as she feared the setting would change him. Thalric, meanwhile, stood at the top of the grand staircase, forced into the rigid, uncomfortable finery of his rank. His dark, formal attire was adorned with the heavy medals and sashes that broadcasted his status to every corner of the room. He felt like a prisoner in his own home, his gaze sweeping the crowded floor, desperate to spot Elowen amidst the sea of faces he despised. The irony was suffocating. He was the master of the night, yet he felt entirely trapped by the expectations of his own legacy. The music began, a sweeping, elegant waltz that forced the dancers into a choreographed dance of power and politics. Elowen felt a pang of deep sadness, realizing that the man she had met in the garden could not possibly exist in this room. The atmosphere was thick with ambition and cold calculation, a polar opposite to the quiet, snowy sanctuary where they had first connected. She prepared herself for the likelihood that their bond would be severed by the very nature of the ballroom floor. The climax of the evening arrived when the doors swung open once more to announce the arrival of the host, the Duke of Westmoreland. Elowen watched, breathless, as the crowd parted to make way for the man who commanded the province. When Thalric stepped fully into the light of the central chandelier, the world seemed to stop for her. The man who had sat on the frost-covered bench, the man who had shared his dreams in whispered tones, was the very duke whose presence was currently causing the entire room to bow. Thalric's eyes locked onto Elowen's from across the room, and he saw the exact moment the realization shattered her. He watched as her face drained of color, her eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and profound confusion. The distance between them, usually a matter of feet, suddenly felt like an unbridgeable canyon. He stood frozen, his hand gripping the hilt of his ceremonial sword, wishing he could undo the last few hours and spare her this public agony. The whispers began immediately, a low, buzzing sound like angry hornets. The guests noticed the intensity of the Duke's gaze fixed upon a young lady of minor standing, and the air turned poisonous with speculation. Thalric ignored the courtly chatter, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had intended to be honest, to speak to her in private, but the timing had been stolen from him, leaving him to witness the light of trust dying in her eyes from across a sea of strangers. Elowen stood on the edge of the terrace, the ballroom's music sounding like a mockery of her pain. Little did she know, the Duke wasn't going to let her walk away that easily. Elowen retreated toward the terrace, the cool air of the night offering the only possible escape from the suffocating scrutiny of the ballroom. She felt as though the floor had been pulled from beneath her feet. Every word they had shared, every vulnerable confession she had made about her life and her dreams, felt tainted by his deception. He hadn't just hidden his name. He had hidden the very reason for the distance between them, letting her believe they were equals while he held all the power in the province. The feeling of betrayal was not just about the title, it was about the manipulation of her heart. She had opened parts of herself that she kept locked away, only to find that she had been performing for an audience of one who was observing her from the heights of his own privilege. She felt small, foolish, and deeply wounded, realizing that the common man she had fallen for was a carefully constructed mask designed to entertain a bored aristocrat. She leaned against the cold stone railing, trembling. She knew that if she stayed, she would be forced to endure the patronizing sympathy of the other ladies, who would surely sense that something had passed between the Duke and the insignificant girl from the provinces. She didn't want his apologies, and she certainly didn't want his attention. All she wanted was to be invisible again, to disappear back into the quiet life she had led before he had intruded upon it. Thalric pursued her, cutting through the throng of sycophants with a ruthlessness that sent people scattering. He stepped out onto the terrace, the sudden silence of the garden a stark contrast to the roar of the music behind them. He began to speak, his voice desperate, explaining that he had only wanted to be seen as a man, not a title. He spoke of his exhaustion, his isolation, and his fear that she would never have spoken to him had she known his identity. Elowen listened to him, her back still turned, his words echoing against the stone walls. To her ears, the explanations sounded like nothing more than the excuses of a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. He spoke of his own loneliness, but it sounded hollow compared to the life of social invisibility she endured every day. She turned to look at him, her expression hardening, and told him that his fear didn't justify the lie that had made her feel small. He tried to reach for her hand, but she stepped back, her movement sharp and decisive. He realized then that his attempts to justify his actions were only making the chasm between them deeper. He had assumed that his vulnerability would be enough to earn her forgiveness, but he had failed to account for the dignity she possessed. A dignity that he had unknowingly trampled upon in his pursuit of his own emotional comfort. The scandal is about to reach its peak. If you're rooting for their path to redemption, subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to watch the next part of their story. The tension between them was palpable, a physical weight that pressed down on the terrace. Thalric realized that the common man she had grown to love had been a ghost, a fantasy he had created to escape his reality. Now, standing before her as the Duke of Westmoreland, he realized that he could never recapture that lightness. The title was not just a name. It was a wall of expectations, duties, and social barriers that now stood between them. Elowen saw him not as the man she had met, but as the embodiment of everything she had learned to fear and resent in their world. He was the system she hated, the power that crushed the small and ignored the marginalized. She told him, her voice steady despite her pain, that he could keep his titles, his lands, and his power, because none of those things could ever replace the trust that he had thrown away in a moment of selfish desire. She walked past him, leaving him standing alone on the terrace, the sound of the waltz drifting out to mock his solitude. He remained there, staring into the darkness, realizing that he had finally achieved exactly what he had feared most. He had become, in her eyes, just another arrogant aristocrat. The weight of his title had finally crushed the possibility of the very love he had been trying to find, leaving him with nothing but the cold realization of his own folly. Elowen retreated from the manor with a hurried, silent desperation, refusing to look back at the illuminated windows that now felt like the eyes of a predator. She returned to her modest quarters, the silence of her room providing the only refuge from the chaos of the night. She didn't cry. Instead, she felt a numbing coldness that settled in her chest, a shield against the pain of being so profoundly deceived by someone she had truly believed to be her equal. She packed a few essential items, not with the intention of running away, but with the resolve to make herself completely inaccessible to the Duke. She knew that in a world where he commanded the land and the law, she could never truly escape him, but she could deny him the one thing he had clearly sought: her unreserved presence and her unfiltered spirit. Her silence would be her final act of defiance. The following morning, she notified her household that she was taking a period of seclusion, effectively cutting off all social ties to the local community. She spent her days in the quiet solitude of her own study, reading books that didn't talk of princes or palaces, and painting landscapes that reflected the gray, overcast skies of her own internal winter. She had chosen to walk alone, preferring the dignity of her solitude to the performative nature of his manufactured intimacy. She thought she had successfully erased herself from his world, but she had no idea that Thalric was about to break every rule he had ever lived by to find her. Thalric, back in the cavernous halls of his manor, found that his life had lost its meaning. He had achieved everything he was born to possess, yet he felt like a pauper wandering through a cemetery of his own making. The manor, which he had always considered a testament to his family's legacy, now felt like a mausoleum of cold marble and suffocating history, devoid of the one voice that had brought life to its halls. He began to notice, with a bitterness he couldn't suppress, that everyone around him was merely waiting for a command or plotting their own advancement. There was no one who saw him, and he realized with a sharp, stabbing regret that he had driven away the only person who had ever truly looked at him without an agenda. The silence that once felt like a privilege now felt like a punishment he had earned. He walked through the corridors at night, the sound of his own footsteps echoing against the walls, reminding him of the emptiness. For years, he had worn his coldness as armor, convincing himself that it was necessary for his position. Now he saw the armor for what it really was: a prison that had kept him from the very love he had subconsciously sought, and which he had now destroyed through his own hubris. The gossip mill of the aristocracy began to grind, turning the mystery of Elowen's sudden disappearance into the primary entertainment of the season. At tea gatherings and morning rides, rumors flew. Some whispered that she had been insulted by a rival, while others claimed the Duke himself had discarded her after a brief, scandalous interest. The cruelty of their speculation was a mirror held up to the vapidity of their lives. Thalric sat through these conversations, forced to endure the patronizing gossip while keeping his composure. He heard them speak her name with a casual, dismissive tone, as if she were a mere character in their trivial plays. Every time he heard her mentioned, he felt a surge of protective fury, Yet he was helpless to defend her without only fueling the fire of their malicious curiosity. He realized that by pulling her into his orbit, even for a short time, he had inadvertently painted a target on her back. He had tried to protect her from the society she hated. Yet his actions had ultimately made her the center of its most toxic attention. The shame he felt was absolute. He had wanted to share his life with her, but instead, he had exposed her to the venom of the very world he had claimed to despise. Thalric began sending emissaries, not to summon her, but to ensure her safety, and to deliver notes of apology that he poured his soul into writing. He stopped carrying out his public duties with the same cold efficiency, his mind entirely occupied by the singular, desperate goal of finding a way to make Elowen understand that his feelings, however poorly handled, were entirely, painfully genuine. He disguised himself once more, riding out to the outskirts of the province, hoping to find her in the garden or near the village, despite knowing that his presence would likely only drive her further away. He searched for a hint of her, a movement in the woods, or a light in her window, a man of immense power humbled by the realization that power was utterly useless in winning the heart of the one woman he had wronged. Each time he returned to the manor without news, he felt a deeper, darker exhaustion. He was a man who had everything at his fingertips, yet he would gladly surrender every title, every acre of land, and every ounce of influence if he could just return to that cold garden bench. He began to understand that love wasn't something to be commanded, as he had commanded everything else in his life. It was a gift to be earned, and he had squandered his only opportunity. The notes arrived at Elowen's home, bound in fine wax and expensive parchment, bearing the crest of the duchy. She didn't open them. Instead, she placed them in a wooden box, unopened and unread, a silent testament to the bridge that had been burned. Each letter was a reminder of his power, a reach across the social chasm that she had no desire to cross. She found that the unopened letters gave her a sense of control over a narrative that had once felt so violently taken from her. Thalric, unaware of the unopened pile growing in her study, continued to pour his regrets onto paper. He wrote about his childhood, about the coldness he had been forced to adopt as a defense mechanism, and about the man he wished he could have been when he first sat beside her. He wasn't trying to justify the lie. He was simply trying to explain the history of the man she had met in the garden, hoping that perhaps, somewhere in that story, there was a trace of the person she had respected. As the weeks turned into months, the pile of letters grew, but the silence from her house remained as impenetrable as a stone wall. Thalric found himself waiting for a response that he knew, deep down, he didn't deserve. The letters were his only connection to his own humanity, the only way he could remain in touch with the emotions that Elowen had awakened in him, even if they were destined to remain forever unread. Thalric began a profound, internal metamorphosis that was as painful as it was necessary. He started to dismantle the cold, unyielding persona he had cultivated for over a decade, recognizing that it was this very armor that had prevented him from ever forming a genuine connection. He stopped attending the mandatory social events, opting instead to spend his time studying the reports of the families in his province, realizing for the first time how much hardship he had been blind to, hidden behind the high walls of his estate. This was not a show of nobility for the sake of public opinion. It was an act of penance. He began to anonymously fund the repairs of the local school and provided resources for the families that had been struggling during the harsh winter. Every action was guided by the memory of Elowen's words, her critique of a system that thrived on indifference, and he sought to rectify his past negligence, one quiet, uncelebrated act of service at a time. He understood that Elowen might never forgive him, and the thought left him in a state of constant, dull ache. Yet he realized that becoming a man worthy of her respect was a goal he had to pursue regardless of the outcome. He was no longer trying to win her back with empty promises or the weight of his name. He was trying to grow into the person she had dared to believe he could be, even if he had ultimately failed her. One afternoon, Thalric discarded his fine silks and noble attire, choosing instead to dress in the humble clothes he had worn when they first met. He rode alone to the small village on the edge of the estate where Elowen had been staying, leaving his guard at a distance. He didn't come to demand an audience. He came simply to be near her, to see if there was even a flicker of life in the house that had remained silent for so long. He stood near the perimeter of her garden, watching the way the sunlight hit the windows of her study. For a moment, he considered just walking up and knocking, but he knew that would be an intrusion she wouldn't tolerate. Instead, he left a small, simple bouquet of winter flowers on her gate. Not the exotic, imported blooms of the manor, but the hardy, native flowers they had talked about on that first day in the garden. It was a gesture of quiet remembrance. As he walked back to his horse, he caught a glimpse of her through the window, a fleeting movement that caused his heart to surge with a mix of longing and grief. He didn't stay to see if she found them. The act of giving was enough to ground him. He was learning, slowly and painfully, that there was a dignity in small, humble gestures that no amount of gold or ducal authority could ever replicate. She didn't know who had left the flowers, but as she touched the petals, she felt a haunting familiarity that was about to change her mind about everything. Eventually, the silence became too heavy to bear, and Elowen, perhaps driven by her own need for closure, decided to confront him. She arrived at the edge of his property, not with a flourish of heralds, but alone on foot. When the guards hesitated, Thalric, who had been watching from his balcony, ordered them to let her pass, his hands trembling as he descended the grand staircase to meet her in the courtyard. The air between them was electric with the history of their deception. Elowen didn't offer a greeting. She simply asked him why he thought the lie was worth the cost of their trust. The confrontation was not a screaming match, but a devastatingly calm examination of his choices. Thalric stood before her, not as a duke, but as a man who had nowhere left to hide, admitting that his greatest fear had been that his reality would never be enough to keep someone like her by his side. He confessed that he had been a coward, blinded by his own insecurities and the belief that the title was his only defining feature. He didn't try to charm her or use his position to sway her. He stood in the cold courtyard and laid bare the shame he had been carrying. It was the most honest conversation they had ever had, and for the first time, Elowen saw him not as a figure of authority, but as a man who was deeply, pathetically human. Elowen looked at the sprawling manor behind him, and then back to his face, finally understanding the true nature of his imprisonment. She realized that while he had the power to dictate the lives of everyone in the province, he had never been allowed to experience the simple, messy vulnerability of choosing his own path. He was a man who owned everything, yet had been denied the basic right to be loved for who he was, beneath the title. She spoke of the loneliness of his life, a reflection of the wealth that acted as a barrier between him and the rest of humanity. It was a realization that moved her. She had been angry, but now a strange, profound pity began to take hold. She saw that his deception wasn't born out of a desire to hurt her, but out of a desperate, panicked need to experience one moment of life that wasn't choreographed by the expectations of the aristocracy. The revelation changed the dynamics of their confrontation. Thalric, who had been bracing for her rejection, found himself undone by the unexpected softness in her eyes. He had been prepared to be hated, but he was entirely unprepared for her empathy. The vulnerability she showed him in that moment, the ability to look past his sins to see the tragedy of his own existence, was the first step toward a reconciliation he had thought impossible. Thalric lowered his head, finally voicing the words he had struggled to speak for months. He asked for her forgiveness, with the explicit understanding that he did not deserve it. He promised that he would continue to change, to live differently, regardless of whether she ever chose to walk back into his life. He made the promise not as a duke, but as a man who finally understood that his actions had consequences. Elowen did not rush to forgive him. She stood in the silence for a long time, letting the weight of his words settle. She told him that forgiveness was a journey she would have to take on her own terms, and that for now, the most he could do was continue to be the man he was currently trying to become. It was a fair, firm boundary, a rejection of the easy path and a demand for continued, sustained effort. As she turned to leave, she didn't offer him a promise of what was to come, but she didn't walk away with the same bitterness she had carried for months. Thalric watched her go, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He hadn't won her back, but he had opened a door that had been firmly shut. He had made his confession, and for the first time, he felt the possibility of a future that wasn't built on a foundation of lies. Over the coming months, Elowen found herself hearing reports of the Duke's transformation, though she remained strictly in her self-imposed exile. The village was buzzing with talk of a leader who had suddenly become attentive, fair, and strangely humble. She would occasionally walk past the village square and see him, not in his fine carriages, but on foot, speaking with shopkeepers and laborers, his expression marked by a genuine desire to learn rather than to command. She watched him from a distance, her heart performing a slow, guarded rhythm. She noticed that the arrogant, rigid posture that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a grounded, thoughtful presence. He didn't look like a man acting a part. He looked like a man who had finally been stripped of his illusions and was finding value in the reality he had long ignored. It was a subtle, steady change that demanded her attention despite her best efforts to remain indifferent. The most telling sign of his character was his refusal to seek her out aggressively. He knew she had asked for space, and for the first time in his life, he respected a boundary he hadn't set himself. This restraint spoke louder to Elowen than any grand public gesture could have. It was the quiet evidence of a man who was no longer prioritizing his own desires above all else, but was instead cultivating the patience required for genuine growth. One spring morning, Elowen found a small, handcrafted box on her doorstep. Inside was not jewelry or a token of status, but a collection of sketches. Drawings he had made himself during his long, solitary nights at the manor. They were scenes of the garden where they had first met, capturing the exact way the light hit the frost, and sketches of the village people he had been helping. Each sketch was accompanied by a single, brief sentence describing what he had learned that day. The honesty in these drawings cut through Elowen's remaining defenses like a blade. There were no declarations of undying love or attempts to manipulate her emotions. There was only a record of a man trying to understand the world he had been living in, but never truly seeing. She realized that he was sharing his growth with her, not to win her back, but simply because she was the only one who had ever truly seen him beneath the title. She sat in her study for hours, looking through the sketches, finding in them the soul of the man she had originally fallen for. It was a gesture of immense vulnerability, the kind of transparency that required an artist's eye and a penitent's heart. She knew then that the man who had lied to her was gone, replaced by someone who was now brave enough to be seen exactly as he was, imperfect, learning, and deeply human. Elowen finally understood that if she continued to hold on to the hurt, she would be the only one who remained trapped in the past. She realized that the anger she had carried was a weight that was preventing her from living the life she now knew she deserved. She decided that the time had come to release the bitterness, not necessarily for his sake, but for her own freedom. She walked to the manor, but this time her purpose was not one of accusation or retreat. The guards, recognizing the change in her demeanor, stepped aside without a word. She found Thalric in the library, the very room where he had spent so many nights questioning his own life. When he saw her, he didn't stand up to command the room. He remained seated, his expression one of profound, quiet awe at her presence. She told him that she had seen his actions, and that she recognized the man he was becoming. She didn't offer a return to what they had before, for that was impossible. But she offered something perhaps more valuable. A clean slate. She was choosing to leave the betrayal behind, accepting that while the past could not be rewritten, it could finally be closed, allowing both of them the space to breathe once more. The weeks that followed were filled with cautious, intentional conversations. They spent time in the library, not talking about titles or estates, but about the future they were both imagining. Thalric spoke of his plans to change the local governance to include the voices of those he had previously ignored, and Elowen found herself contributing ideas that were met with respect and curiosity, not condescension. It was a slow, deliberate rebuilding. They were getting to know each other, not as a stranger and a lady, or a duke and a commoner, but as two individuals who had both been damaged by the world they lived in. Every conversation was a brick in a new foundation, one built on transparency rather than the shaky ground of secrecy. They were learning the language of true equality, a concept that was foreign to both of them, but vital to their survival. Thalric found that his life felt fuller not because of the power he wielded, but because of the partnership he was cautiously developing. He wasn't trying to possess Elowen. He was trying to grow alongside her. It was a humbling realization that for the first time, his happiness was no longer centered on his own satisfaction, but on the joy of witnessing her potential unfold in a world that had finally stopped trying to stifle it. The season concluded with a quiet celebration, not a grand performative ball, but an intimate gathering of the village people whose lives had been improved by the Duke's recent reforms. Elowen stood by Thalric's side, and as she looked out over the crowd, she realized that the true definition of nobility wasn't found in the crown or the name, but in the service one provided to others. Thalric reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. He whispered that he was still the same man who had sat on the garden bench, but he was finally beginning to understand why it was worth being the Duke. It wasn't about the power. It was about the platform it gave him to do good, and to stand beside a woman who challenged him to be better every single day. They walked together toward the garden, the place where everything had begun, and left the ballroom far behind them. The story of their love wasn't a fairy tale of instant perfection, but a real, gritty, beautiful account of two people who had chosen to be honest, to be vulnerable, and to be brave. They had redefined what it meant to lead and what it meant to love, finding a future that was, at last, entirely their own. True nobility is not found in a title, but in the integrity of one's actions and the courage to be honest, even when the truth is the most difficult path. This journey taught us that true nobility is measured by the heart, not by a title. If this story touched your soul, and you want to see more historical dramas where love overcomes the highest barriers, click that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with someone who loves a beautiful romance. Also, tell me in the comments, would you be able to forgive such a deep betrayal? I want to hear your thoughts.